All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. This is Top Steps Best Practices for Auditing Data in Your Professional Services Automation System. I'm Jimmy Morales. I'm one of the senior business consultants here, and today we're going to be talking about auditing. The first thing to consider is why data audits? Why is this even a topic that's worth having a full-on presentation about, and something that we can get fully engaged on? And to be quite honest, it's just a fact of life, right? It's a part of something that we in the professional services and other organizational pillars industries experience, and a lot of times it comes up out of the blue, and it comes up out of the blue unexpectedly for a variety of different reasons. And so when you're thinking about data audits, which may not be the most exciting topic in the moment, unless it's actually coming up and it's something that is very valid, consider it like this: when it's not on the table, life is simple. You get what you get out, what you put in, right? But to put it on adding another layer to it, right? PSA is simple, and you get out what you put in. So data auditing, it's very much a necessity. It should not be something that should be a frustrating aspect of running your business. And in fact, if you're staying on top of things, you can be ahead of what usually will prompt things like audits. And normally we consider audits prompted by, there's an emergency in the system, there's some kind of data review that we need to do, some kind of cleanup on something that is error prone as far as data management in the system. And the other word, which some people think is scary and other people actually get kind of excited about, which are auditors and auditing. So when you're actually running a full-on audit. But there are really 5 main elements that we want to focus on today as far as the life of data auditing, right? So process and policy compliance, data accuracy and completeness, change management and adoption, and system maintenance, and of course, auditors. And we tend to kind of pigeonhole the view to the auditors and partially the system maintenance side. But again, if you're staying on top of your database management and your process flows, these other areas start to come in to play. Process and policy first and foremost. If you've implemented a process and procedures, and it's important to ensure that your organizational members are following them. So for example, when you're using, say, OpenAir, defining those processes and making sure that you can measure those types of adoption rates. And some of that information isn't readily accessible right out of every single KPI in your system. So you might need to run audits and be able to see how performance is being accepted. If data accuracy and completeness, this one should be kind of obvious, but if you're not tagging your information very thoroughly and very fully, then you might not be getting certain data points, and you might need to run into the audit mechanisms of your systems to be able to extract that key information. And that's where you can start to look into auditing and the audit trails for data accuracy and completeness and fullness of all of those different data points. And you can see that history behind it. Change management and adoption. This one, again, should be quite obvious, but as you run into auditing your system and running through the workflows and life cycles of different processes, then you can start to define how new change management and new initiatives that are around the corner, how well they can be adopted, because then you can start to measure how well are they being captured today. System maintenance, in the work sphere of Top Step, we do a lot of work with different organizations where we do have to do a lot of system maintenance, and we find ourselves running through auditing through these systems to see exactly what is being used, how well it's being used, whether or not it's necessary, and you can start to remove clutter or noise in your systems. And then, of course, that leads into performance as well. And then, of course, auditors, and a lot of times it's comes out of left field and just kind of appears as an urgent need. And those are the situations where if you're ahead of the curve and you're prepared, it's less of a painful process. And so let's go through these elements, one at a time. So from process and policy and compliance perspective, a lot of times we think of things like timesheets. Timesheet is a really great example from a professional services standpoint of how the running through an audit lifecycle is very useful. And so from a timesheet perspective, we think of, let's break it down into a couple different areas, right? So a common issue could be use of notifications in OpenAir to be able to see how well compliance is being followed. It can have downstream impact, of course, with cash flow and billing processes. So we may need to have the traceability that we run through. And so understanding the system becomes part of that. But all of that really wraps up to the high level workflow, which let's talk about those some popular metrics. And that's the high level overview of that timesheet workflow that we need to understand. So again, going with compliance, going with those notifications, items like expenses, submission, and making sure that it's done within, say, a defined window, projects in the right life cycle stage, reflecting, the right health of the project's life cycle, ensuring resources are set up with the proper controls. So when it comes to the processing and policy compliance side of things, understanding the business is really the first step. And you can kind of flow through some of these items step by step, but understanding the business is really you're positioning yourself and kind of orienting yourself to stage your way through the auditing process. And so outline it, kind of build that workflow. Maybe, again, if it's not very exciting to you, just having it at least in your head. And so if you do understand the entire life cycle of an individual process, you can kind of trace those elements back, and then you can capture things more closely with process and policy compliance. Talking about data accuracy and completeness. So data accuracy and completeness is critical for every single organization. However, a lot of organizations are finding themselves to be a lot more piecemeal these days. And so you're working out of various systems. And when you have a disconnect or some kind of communication break between different systems, a lot of times what we see is tracking data outside of the professional services automation tool, or any tool for that matter. And the more data you track outside of it, the more difficult it can become to obviously trace this kind of information. And so what you really want to do is build an audit structure that that can be used almost like as metrics that you can track across the system. So for example, you can do plan versus actuals, accuracy for resource scheduling, project setup completeness and alignment with SOW. So, or baselining, for example, bill rates, and making sure that you can reduce invoice corrections. So when you're tracking that kind of information outside of the system, it becomes much more difficult to audit. So when you have that seamless workflow, it becomes part of the architecture of your system to make sure that you're capturing this kind of detail to make your audit life easier. And that's ultimately what the goal would be, because again, as we get near the ends of these slides and we talk about the unexpected auditor coming in, you're going to need to be able to answer some questions about this kind of information. So you want to make sure, if a question might come up about the plans versus actuals or project setup completeness, and number one, obviously for financial teams, typically would be bill rates, adjustments, things like that, there needs to be traceability. And so having it all in one system and having the data points there and completeness behind it is extremely useful. When it comes to change management and adoption, bottom line, change is very hard. Delegating that change is harder. Permeating that change throughout the organization can be very, very difficult. And it's something that anybody in the change management side of the business finds themselves having to kind of battle the natural inclination to resistance to change that organization members have. And so from an audit trail perspective and an auditing perspective, adoption needs some kind of measure, and measures support audits. And so what that means is setting up the expectations for what the new change is going to be, and saying starting XYZ date, we will be doing XYZ KPI type of change, or XYZ type of organizational structure change. And so what that will do is set those expectations for the audit that you're going to need to run by that date. So planning for change management from an audit perspective means having that audit in the back of your mind whenever there is a change around the corner. And this is something that is often forgotten. And that's that we focus so much on the change that we lose sight of there's going to be a lot of history that we're going to have to dig up through this change to make sure that we can support this change and support adoption for this change. And of course, delegate that change so it permeates through the rest of the organization. When you're considering that, consider highlighting metrics for improvement. So what is that change that you're going to need to do that you're going to need to orient your audit around? So highlighting metrics for improvement, such as reducing timesheet corrections, increasing forecasted utilization. What's the performance metric that you're trying to capture? What are the data points that you have today? And how well can you stage yourself now and position yourself so that you can audit all of that information as you approach XYZ date, as we mentioned? Because the ultimate goal is that we need to learn from the data, and you need to be able to capture that. And that goes back into the previous slide, as we talked about with the data management side of things. So, while change can be hard, as we know, it's something that does typically result in something beneficial. And so we need to be able to communicate to the person who is resisting the change what the value add is of that. And a lot of that comes from traceability into the history of your system. When it comes to system maintenance, while this one might seem like it's very much a given, it's often forgotten as well. And so a well-maintained system can help you save ultimately money, right? Time and costs from freeing up user licenses. You're auditing the usage of your system, and you pay for licenses typically on a user by user basis in most platforms, or groups, bulk, blocks of users rather. So you can save by maintaining the system well enough and just beginning there. And that's kind of an easy starting point. Cleaning up reports. Again, this goes back to the data side of things. What's the noise in your system that you need to remove? And this is something that I had just gone through in a couple of instances with some of our clients, where we have to go through the system and say what's slowing down the system, what kind of things are impacting performance, what are the data points that are not being used, and that can improve performance, which it adds up over time. If the system's just running slow and it takes 15 minutes to get the bill out the door, and it's because of system noise, then you can shave that off on every instance and just extrapolate that over time, and that adds up. Custom and standard fields, for example, and this is very much oriented towards the OpenAir and NetSuite side of the tools, but for whatever purposes are, those custom and standard fields that you build throughout the system, which ones are always the default value, which ones have unused values, which ones are unused altogether. And for example, if you have a lot of drop-down values, selectable values across your system for whatever type of record, and then someone at some point in time has changed or updated those values, all your historical records are going to preserve some of that information, and all of your future date forward. So setting are going to preserve, the change. And so if you have a new data point that you're trying to capture, you want to, at some point, mark when that change has happened and be able to trace and be able to answer ultimately the question of why did this change happen, and how do we clean up our system throughout that process to be able to respect that change? Are we actually perpetuating that change all the way into history because we've reformatted a certain business unit to be another or fall under the hierarchy of another business unit? What is the reason why we did that? And why did all of our values change? And those are the types of questions that you do need to almost always be ready to answer, because the question can come up out of nowhere. And so having that uniformity in the system is absolutely critical, which ultimately leads to auditors, right? So the term auditor, the person that is the auditor, it can trigger different emotions for different folks. I worked with someone years ago who was very excited about auditing, and it was something that he was very, very passionate about. And that's because he found himself in a position of kind of being the protector of the organization. And that meant protecting it from fines and, any kind of legal troubles that you might run into from not having a well-maintained system that you can answer the questions for. So, well, for some, they may be the enemies of disruption, and for others, they're the friends, right? Because again, they are helping you, and your own internal auditor is you ultimately. So data audits do ultimately benefit you, and the ones that in particular can is when you know your PSA capabilities for audit trails. So understand what your system is able to trace. And again, that goes back to the beginning of position yourself so that you are able to capture those and be able to answer the questions of why. So audit trails can answer what changed, when was it changed, or when was this item created, who did it, and a number of other a number of other attributes. But ultimately, you as the person who is supporting the audit friendliness of your system and the auditors that may come up in your PSA life, all you need to know is why. You need to be able to answer the why behind a lot of this. And that goes all the way back into traceability and documentation and being able to capture that within a single system, preferably, which brings us back to the whys behind the what's behind the various benefits of the audit and where you need to position yourself. So again, that goes back to process and policy compliance. That goes back to data accuracy and completeness, change management and adoption, system maintenance, and auditors. So our hope with this presentation is that you can, one, kind of capture these 5 elements and consider those when you're doing something like data management or change management and adoption. When you're going through your system and cleaning up things, position yourself in a way to where you can answer the why. And as long as you have that, audits are not going to be a huge pain for you. And so that is the, obviously the recommendation. So that brings us to, what the tools that are available in your arsenal to be able to capture this kind of thing. So, PSA tools such as OpenAir, obviously Oracle and NetSuite, very powerful tools that capture the entire life cycle, transaction by transaction, record by record, and being able to extract that data becomes very, very useful in the long term for when you're making those types of decisions, and then obviously positioning yourself. So OpenAir is a very useful tool that's here to help run your organization smoothly. Providing accurate reports requires accurate data. So if you need to be able to, what you get in is what you get out. What you put in is what you get out, rather. Establish those measures and metrics. Make sure you use them. Perform configuration maintenance and data reviews periodically. The frequency really depends and varies organization by organization, but don't let them fall to the wayside, because what happens ultimately is organizations have turnover and information, knowledge inception gets lost, and that transposition of information gets lost on the wayside, and then 2 years down the road, you're finding yourself wondering, why did XYZ ever happen? And so you want to make sure that you capture all of that. And again, it goes back to what you put in is what you get out. So audit activities, keep your system clean. And that's ultimately the best way to sum this up. So if you do want to learn more, again, I'm Jimmy. I'm here with TopStep. TopStep is a leading provider of business efficiency solutions for your PS business operations. We've served over 360 clients. We have deep expertise in PS business operations. We've gone through this kind of audit lifecycle, and all of this